The chair made a sound like a small apology when Marcus Webb pulled it out from under the table. A soft scrape against composite flooring that somehow carried all the way across the crowded mess hall and landed in the wrong ears. He didn't notice. He was reading the pamphlet. It was a folded sheet of flimsy that the docking authority on Helix Station handed to every new arrival who came in on a civilian transport which Marcus had. The pamphlet was titled Cultural Sensitivity in Multi-Species Environments, a practical guide for new personnel, and Marcus had been reading it since he boarded the shuttle, which was 4 hours ago, which meant he had read it approximately 9 times. It was 6 pages long. It covered things like proper salutation distances for Grenthari, the correct way to signal non-aggression to the Veshcom species cluster, and a bold font warning on page 4 about not making prolonged eye contact with anything from the Ildrani reaches. Marcus was 23 years old, had graduated at the bottom of his xenodiplomacy cohort, not failing, exactly, just consistently landing in the range the professors described as not yet fluent in situational awareness. And this was his first posting outside the Sol system. He was a junior attaché to a trade negotiation that wouldn't begin for 11 days, and right now he was hungry, and there was an empty table with a seat, and he sat down in it. He went back to page 4. He did not look up to assess the table. He did not observe the 3-meter clearing that surrounded the table on all sides. He did not notice the way the chatter in the mess hall dropped by roughly 40% in the half-second after his chair scraped the floor. He turned to page 5, which was about dining protocols. The being across from him had been sitting at this table for 6 standard minutes before Marcus arrived. She had selected it for its position, back to the wall, full sightlines to both entrance corridors, close enough to the emergency pressure doors that she could breach the outer hull and survive vacuum longer than anything else in the station could hold its breath. She was Vrethkai. Specifically, she was Essara Vreth, which translated from the Vrethkai primary tongue as something between the silence that kills fleets and she who was there when the Keth Armada burned, depending on which regional dialect you used for the verb. She was, by most reckonings, the most dangerous individual currently in this sector of the contested arc, a distinction she had held for 11 years running and had never once needed to publicize, because the reputation publicized itself. Things simply happened around Essara Vreth. Fleets that challenged her ended. Warlords who placed bounties on her tended to discover that the bounty had somehow been reassigned. A Grenthari crime syndicate had once attempted to detain her in a station very similar to this one, and the station was currently being used as an asteroid survey reference point, because it was no longer large enough or intact enough to be called a station. She was 4-limbed and bilaterally symmetric in a way that superficially read as humanoid until you noticed the secondary musculature beneath the skin, the way her joints bent fractionally wrong when she moved, the flat chrome black of her eyes that held no pupil and no white, only depth. She had 3 parallel scars running from her left jaw down the side of her neck, which she had never bothered to have regenerated, because she wore them the way a ship wears battle scars, as communication. She was dressed in what looked like civilian clothing, and was, in fact, ablative composite threaded through a woven fiber matrix with a tensile yield that would stop most slug-throwers. She had a cup of something hot in front of her. She was considering a decision that would determine the political balance of 3 star systems for the next generation. She was not expecting company. The human sat down, opened a pamphlet, and began reading it with the focused expression of someone who was not aware they were about to die. Essara Vreth watched him for 10 seconds without moving. He turned a page. In her experience, which was extensive, lethal, and spanned 3 decades of operating in spaces where most beings didn't survive the afternoon, there were patterns to how creatures behaved when they accidentally entered her proximity. The most common response was immediate, involuntary stillness followed by a rapid and undignified retreat. The second most common was a kind of frozen paralysis, while the creature's nervous system caught up with what its instincts were screaming. The third, rarest category was the deliberate approach, which she had only ever seen from beings who were either very skilled or very suicidal, and the two groups were difficult to distinguish until you found out which one survived. This human had done none of those things. He had simply sat down and started reading a pamphlet. She looked at the pamphlet. She could read standard at 30 meters. The title was visible on the fold. Cultural Sensitivity in Multi-Species Environments, a Practical Guide for New Personnel. HFY sat with this information for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She waited to see what would happen next, not because she couldn't end the situation, but because she was, against every instinct she'd built over 3 decades, genuinely curious. Marcus found page 5. Page 5 covered dining protocols across 12 species. It noted, in a helpful sidebar, that many non-human species used shared meals as a form of social bonding and territorial acknowledgement simultaneously, and that sitting at a stranger's table without invitation could be interpreted depending on species as either a serious insult or a declaration of kinship, and that new personnel were advised to observe seating arrangements carefully before committing to a chair. Marcus read this, looked up for the first time, and made eye contact with a pair of flat chrome-black eyes that contained, as best he could tell, the accumulated weight of approximately 3 decades of experience in ending conflicts by ending the things that caused them. He looked back down at the pamphlet. He looked back up. He looked at the empty station around the table. He looked at the way the nearest occupied tables were all pushed to the far end of the hall. He thought about what the pamphlet had said about seating arrangements. Marcus said, may have made a mistake. The chrome-black eyes studied him. The being across the table had not moved. She had the absolute stillness of something that did not need to signal readiness because it was always ready. You are reading that guide, she said. Her standard was perfect, unaccented, delivered at a register that landed somewhere between conversation and infrastructure. It was the voice of something that had been translating languages for longer than Marcus had been alive. For the first time. 9th time, Marcus said, but I may have missed page 5. A pause that had texture to it. You have been reading this guide for how long? Since waypoint Naru, 4 hours. And you did not reach page 5. I kept going back to page 3. There's a section on Grenthari salutation distances that I couldn't get clear in my head. If you lead with the right hand, you're indicating. A territorial challenge, HFY said, unless the thumb is folded inward, in which case it is a greeting of approximate equals. The Grenthari have 47 distinct hand salutations, and they all hinge on individual finger positions. She looked at him steadily. Who sent you? Nobody sent me. I was hungry. Nobody sits at this table. I didn't know it was your table. There are no place markers. He looked down at the table's surface as if confirming this, which he was. I'll go. I'm sorry for the... He glanced at his pamphlet. I'm sorry if the sitting down read as territorial. I was trying to. Stay. He stopped halfway out of the chair. The mess hall, which had been watching this exchange with the riveted attention of beings who were calculating survival odds and finding the math unusual, did not breathe. Marcus sat back down slowly, with the careful movement of someone trying not to make any gesture that could be read as any of the 47 Grenthari salutations. Your name, HFY said. Marcus, Webb, Junior Attaché Sol System Diplomatic Corps Trade Negotiation Division. He paused. I haven't started yet. The negotiation, it starts in 11 days. This is my first posting outside of Sol. I know what Sol is. Right, yes. Of course. She picked up her cup of whatever it was and drank from it without taking her eyes off him. It was a deliberate act, using a hand, leaving the other one still on the table, visible, which by Vrethkai's secondary convention was a signal that she had chosen not to be actively dangerous for the duration. Marcus didn't know Vrethkai's secondary convention. He was still on page 5 of his pamphlet. But something in the body language read as familiar enough that his nervous system, which had been vibrating at a frequency it normally reserved for very high places and very fast vehicles, stepped down slightly. "What do you know about this station?" she asked. "Helix Station. Primary trading waypoint for the contested Arc nominal Galactic Commerce Authority oversight but effectively self-governing. 3 main docking rings. Population approximately," he was reading from memory from the briefing materials, 40 to 60,000 on any given rotation, species diversity high enough that GCA considers it a cultural buffer zone. He looked up. "I read the briefing materials too. I read a lot of things. I'm not always good at applying them in the moment." "I noticed." "Is that," he paused, calibrating, "was that a joke?" Saravreth looked at him for a long moment. Among the Vrethkai, humor was a form of threat assessment. The ability to find something funny required a baseline security in your own survival. Beings that were genuinely afraid did not laugh. She had used humor precisely twice in professional settings in the past 11 years, and both times it had destabilized her opponent's threat reading more effectively than any weapon. "No," she said. "Right. Tell me why you are nervous." "I'm sitting across from someone who, I don't know who you are specifically, but the fact that there is a 3-meter exclusion zone around this table suggests that you are someone who has caused it to be wise for others to maintain a 3-meter exclusion zone around this table, which is the kind of thing that makes me nervous." "But you sat down anyway." "I was reading page 3. She set her cup down. Marcus had been in exactly one situation prior to this one that had felt like the world was paying very close attention to what he did next, which was when he was 11 years old and had accidentally started a small fire in his school's chemistry lab, and the teacher had looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether the situation was recoverable. He had put the fire out with his jacket, which was not the prescribed method but had worked, and the teacher had later told his parents that he had good instincts under pressure and poor instincts about not getting into pressure situations in the first place. He felt that the current situation was similar, except the chemistry teacher had not had flat chrome-black eyes and 3 scars, and the ambient quality of a detonation waiting for a trigger. "What is your assignment here?" Saravreth said. "Trade negotiation. The Velori Compact is trying to formalize resource-sharing arrangements for the outer contested Arc extraction fields. The Corps is sending a team because several of the human-operated transit lanes run through the Arc and we have a stake in the outcome." He paused. "I'm very junior. I'll mostly be taking notes." "You are the note-taker. For now. And your senior staff. Who leads the negotiation?" "Consul Amara Diaz." He pulled a small data card from his breast pocket and read the name off it, which told Saravreth something she found more interesting than the name itself, that he had needed to check. "She arrives in 9 days with the main team." "I know Amara Diaz." Marcus looked up. "She is competent," Saravreth said, which from her was a statement of considerable weight. "The negotiation will not fail on human terms. It will fail on Velori terms." "What do you mean?" She looked at him with the flat chrome assessment of something deciding how much to say to a note-taker. "The Velori Compact has sent 3 delegates. 1 is authorized to negotiate. 2 are authorized to observe and report to the Compact leadership, who will then decide whether to ratify anything the first delegate agrees to. The first delegate knows this and will therefore agree to nothing of substance, because anything of substance will be rejected when it returns home, which will reflect poorly on the delegate." She paused. "The negotiation will produce a framework document that both sides will describe as significant progress. Nothing will change." The extraction rights will remain contested. Human transit lanes will remain subject to informal tariffs. Marcus looked at his data card. He looked at page 5 of the pamphlet. He looked up. How do you know this? Because it is the third time the Velori Compact has sent this configuration of delegates. They send it when they want to appear to negotiate without negotiating. She watched his face. You did not know this. No, is it in the briefing materials? No. Then I couldn't have. No, you couldn't have. Something shifted in the quality of her stillness, a degree of assessment he hadn't felt before. You are genuinely junior. I said that. Beings who are junior often claim seniority. You did not. She was quiet for a moment. What will you do with this information? Marcus thought about it. He thought about it for long enough that the thinking was visible on his face, which was not a diplomatic habit but was an honest one. I'll write it in my notes, he said finally. For Consul Diaz, she can decide whether to change the approach. She will not change the approach. The approach is set by the core policy framework, which was written by people who have not been to the contested Ark. Then I'll note that too. He looked at her directly. I'm sorry, this is probably a very boring problem from your position. The thing that happened next was something that none of the beings watching from the far end of the mess hall could explain afterward in any way that made their reports cohere. Saravreath, who had not changed expression in any way that any of them could detect through the entire preceding exchange, did something with her face that one of the Grenthari observers would describe as a minor tectonic shift around the mouth area, and a Veshcom would call the third expression, and a human at the far table who had served 4 years in the contested Ark would simply describe later as, I think she almost smiled. It is not boring, she said. Marcus put the pamphlet down. Not away, he set it flat on the table like he was bookmarking his place. Can I ask who you are? You don't have to answer, but you know about the Velori configuration and you have the, he gestured vaguely at the empty 3-meter radius, this. And I'm going to be writing notes for 11 days and then going home, so I'm not a threat to anything. She considered him for a length of time that felt geological. Saravreath. He reached for the pamphlet instinctively, then stopped himself. It's not in there, she said. I figured you'd need a different pamphlet. There are no pamphlets. Right? No, sorry. He folded his hands on the table, which was a very human gesture for composure and was not in any guide to multi-species interaction, because it had never occurred to anyone that a human would need to use it at this particular table. I've heard the name. In the briefing. There's a section on notable figures in the contested Ark, and your name was in it, and the briefing said that GCA had flagged you as someone whose activities in the Ark were of significant strategic relevance. He paused. The section was 3 sentences long. That is more sentences than most beings receive. Were they accurate? She looked at him. The first sentence was accurate, she said. The second was approximately correct in its conclusions and wrong in its reasoning. The third was wrong about which system. I could correct the file for the record. The record does not need correcting. It is more useful as it is. Marcus picked up the pamphlet. He put it back down. He had the look of someone who was trying to locate the edges of a situation that didn't have edges, which was accurate. You're sitting here alone, he said, at a table that nobody else sits at, and you've been here since before I came in because your cup is almost empty and mine is, I didn't order one yet. He looked around. Nobody had come to take his order. He thought about why nobody had come to take his order and set that aside. You're waiting for something. The chrome-black eyes did not change. Or thinking about something, Marcus said, a decision. What makes you say that? Because you could have made me leave. You haven't. And you answered my question about the Velori. You could have not answered that. People don't tell note-takers things they don't need to know unless they have a reason to. And the only reason I can think of is that you needed to say it to someone, or you wanted to see what someone who didn't know it would say when they heard it. Esarevrath was quiet for long enough that two beings at the far end of the mess hall quietly left. "You said you are going home after the negotiation," she said. "Yes." "Have you ever been to the Outer Arc?" "No, this is my first posting outside Saul." "The Outer Arc's extraction fields, the ones the Velori negotiation is nominally about." She turned her cup in her hands, a slow rotation that she was not aware she was doing. "There are 17 inhabited stations in the Outer Arc. Human-constructed, occupied by human miners and transit workers and their families. They have been there for 6 years. In those 6 years, they have built what I believe your species calls a community, which is your particular way of taking a place that was nothing and making it something by putting roots into it." A pause. "The informal tariffs that the Corps accepts as a cost of transit are being used to fund a Velori operation that will, within 18 months, make those stations uninhabitable." The mess hall had lost another 4 occupants. Marcus sat very still. "The briefing didn't say that," he said. "The briefing does not know that." "How do you?" "Because I know who funds what in this sector. Because 3 months ago, a Velori logistics supply chain developed a particular gap that is only consistent with the diversion of significant resources toward a specific kind of pressure campaign. Because I have been watching the contested arc for 11 years, and I know what the patterns look like before the outcome is visible." She set the cup down. "The negotiation your consul is coming to conduct will produce nothing, and the people in the Outer Arc will lose their homes. And no pamphlet will explain to them why." Marcus looked at the pamphlet. He looked at it for a while. "What would actually help them?" he said. "A different negotiation. One in which someone informs the Velori Compact leadership directly, not through a delegate but directly, that the Sol Diplomatic Corps is aware of the logistics diversion, that the specific transaction records have been archived, that they will be provided to GCA arbitration if the pressure campaign proceeds." She paused. "The Compact leadership is not aware that anyone outside the Compact knows this. If someone told them that someone knows, the calculus changes." "Who could do that?" The chrome-black eyes found him with a quality of attention that made the hair on his arms register the wrong way, like he was standing too close to something very large that was not yet moving. "Someone with access to the console," she said, "who would not be dismissed as a threat because they are not threatening, who would not be surveilled by the Compact's intelligence people because they are very junior and therefore invisible, who has 11 days before the negotiation begins to put a specific piece of information in a specific person's hands." Marcus looked at the pamphlet. "I'm a note-taker," he said. "Yes." "I take notes, I pass them to the consul." "Yes." "If I told you I'd do it," he said slowly, "you'd have no way of knowing I would. I could walk out of here and go to bed and not do anything, and nothing would happen to me because you still don't have a reason to do anything to someone who just sat at the wrong table." Esarevrath looked at him. "No," she said. "I would have no way of knowing. And you're asking me anyway." "I am not asking you." She turned the cup again, slow and unthinking. "I am giving you information. What you do with it is yours." Marcus sat with this. He sat with it in the particular way that humans sit with things that are too big for the available furniture. Shoulders slightly forward, hands flat on the table, looking at the middle distance where there is nothing to look at but the thinking is happening anyway. He was 23 years old. He had graduated near the bottom of his cohort. He was on his first posting outside Saul, reading a 6-page guide that he had now read 9 times and still managed to sit at exactly the wrong table. His job for the next 11 days was to take notes. He would go home after the negotiation with a file of notes that would be processed into a summary document that would be read by people further up the core hierarchy, who would decide what to do with it, which meant it would sit in a review queue for 4 to 6 months before anyone looked at it. He thought about 17 stations in the outer arc. He thought about communities, which was his species' way of taking a place that was nothing and making it something. He thought about a 3-sentence briefing entry, and how the first sentence had been accurate and the second approximately correct, and the third wrong about which system. He picked up the pamphlet. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. "What's the name of the specific transaction record?" he said, "and where would I find it?" Something happened in the quality of the air at the table. It was not dramatic. It was not visible. It was the kind of shift that beings who had spent enough time in dangerous places learned to feel in their skin, the moment when a situation that had been undecided reached a conclusion. Sarah reached into the inner pocket of her civilian clothing and set a small data chip on the table between them. It was the size of a thumbnail and had no markings. "Everything on that chip," she said, "is verifiable through GCA public records. Nothing on it was obtained through methods that would compromise whoever uses it." Marcus picked it up. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it. "You prepared this," he said, "before I sat down." "I have been waiting for someone to sit at this table," she said, "for 4 days." He looked up at her. The chrome-black eyes were flat and deep and gave him nothing, which was, he was beginning to understand, not the absence of expression, but a different kind of expression than the ones he'd been trained to read. "Why didn't you just," he stopped, reconsidered. "You could have approached the consul directly, or sent this through official channels, or a dozen other things." "Yes. But you didn't." "No. Because official channels can be traced. And if the Compact's intelligence people see a direct contact between Sarah and the Sol consul before a negotiation, the calculus changes in the wrong direction." He paused. "But a note-taker who sat at the wrong table because they were reading page 3, nobody traces that. Nobody even sees it." The flat eyes watched him. "The 3-sentence briefing," Marcus said. "The 2 beings who watched us from the far table and left. The fact that nobody came to take my order." He looked around the mess hall, which was significantly less populated than it had been 20 minutes ago, and was distributed in a way that had every remaining occupant sitting as far from this table as the room allowed. "Everyone here knows who you are. So everyone here will remember that a confused human junior attaché sat at the wrong table and got told off and left." He paused. "That's what they'll tell people, if anyone asks." "If anyone asks," she agreed. "You're very good at this." "I have had time to practice." Marcus tucked the data chip into the same pocket as the pamphlet. He thought about what it meant to carry something like this for 11 days without looking like he was carrying something. He thought about what it meant to hand it to a consul who was coming in with a policy framework and a predetermined approach, and a mandate from the core hierarchy that had been decided by people who had never been to the contested arc. He thought about what Consul Diaz would do with the information, which was the question Sarah had not answered because it was the one variable she couldn't control. "Amara Diaz," he said, "you said she was competent." "Yes." "What does that mean to you, specifically?" Sarah looked at him with something that was not quite what he would have called consideration, in the same way that a deep space navigational array was not quite what he would have called a calculator. "She changes the approach when the approach needs changing," she said. "She has done it twice in my knowledge of her, once in the Neth corridor dispute and once in the Velori's previous framework negotiation 4 years ago. Both times she was told by her hierarchy that the approach was set. Both times she changed it." "What happened?" "The Neth corridor is open transit. The Velori's 4-year-old framework is still being cited as a model for how the GCA wants contested resource negotiations conducted." Marcus looked at his hands. "She'll need the transaction records," he said, "and she'll need to know that the compact leadership doesn't know anyone has them. Those are the two things." "Yes. And she'll need to know where the information came from, even if she can't use that information officially, because she needs to trust its quality." "Yes. Which means I need to tell her where I got it." The chrome-black eyes found him again. "That is your decision," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "If I tell her and she uses it, and the compact finds out there was a contact, not an official contact, just a human junior attaché who sat at the wrong table." "Then the story is that you sat at the wrong table," Sarah said, "which is true, and that you were given information you did not seek, by someone whose interests in the outer arc are well documented and do not require explanation." She paused. "The Velori Compact will not pursue it further. They have larger concerns than tracing a note-taker's sources." "And you?" "I am always a concern to someone. It is not new." Marcus almost smiled, which was a thing that didn't quite happen but was close enough that the Grenthari observer at the far end of the hall, who had not yet left, would note it in his own log as the human made a face suggesting either amusement or gas discomfort, unclear which. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. Sarah waited. 4 days, he said. "You sat at this table for 4 days waiting for someone to sit down at it. You could have stood up and walked across the hall to anyone at any point. You could have sent a message. You could have done it 100 different ways." He looked at her. "Why the table?" The silence at the table was a particular quality of silence. Not the silence of an absence, but the silence of something choosing not to speak, which is different. "Because the beings who need to understand the outer arc," she said finally, "are the ones who will sit at the wrong table without knowing it is the wrong table. The ones who walk in already knowing are already decided. They are useless." She turned the empty cup. "I needed someone who was still reading page 3. Marcus looked at the breast pocket where the pamphlet was. He had read it 9 times. He had not gotten to page 5. "I'll read the rest of it on the way back," he said, "probably. It will not help you with anything you need to do." "No, but it covers Ildrani eye contact protocol, and I'm going to be here for 11 days. Sarah set the cup down one final time, with a precision and finality that Marcus read correctly as the end of the meeting. She did not stand. She looked at him with the flat chrome eyes that gave him nothing and everything at once, and she said, "The Ildrani who are currently on this station are on deck 7. They are traders. They are not in the habit of prolonged eye contact with beings smaller than themselves, which is most beings, which means the protocol is largely academic in your case." "Good to know." "Go eat," she said. "You said you were hungry." Marcus stood up. He pushed the chair back in, carefully, quietly, and picked up nothing because he had nothing to pick up except the pocket's worth of pamphlet and data chip, and the particular weight of something that had not yet become what it was going to be. He stood at the side of the table for a moment. "Thank you," he said, which was not diplomatic language, not the correct registered formality for ending an interaction with a figure of significant strategic relevance in the contested arc, not anything his training had covered. It was just what he said. Sarah did not respond. He walked away. He went to the ordering station at the far end of the hall and got a bowl of something that smelled like it might be soup, and found a table near the wall, not against it, just near it, and sat down and ate it. He took the pamphlet out and read pages 5 through 6 while he ate, and then he read the section on Ildrani protocols, which was, as Sarah had implied, academic. He ate the soup. It was, as it turned out, soup. At the table against the wall, Sarah sat for 23 more minutes without moving. She had not gotten what she expected. She had not gotten anything like what she expected. She had been expecting someone she would need to persuade, and she had received instead someone who had simply said yes. and the simplicity of it sat in her chest in a way she had not felt in a long time, which was the feeling of something that was not a transaction. It was, she thought, what humans called trust, which was a thing they extended the way they built communities, with a stubbornness that didn't look like stubbornness from the inside, because from the inside it looked like eating soup. She left the table. The mess hall slowly normalized behind her. And on deck 7, not long after, a young man in a Corps uniform stopped at the corridor junction and read page 5 of his pamphlet very carefully and then walked on, and nobody who saw him would have known he was carrying anything except his pamphlet, which was, in the end, the point. The negotiation began on schedule. Consul Amara Diaz arrived on day 9 with 7 staff members, 3 sets of policy frameworks, and a mandate that had been approved at 3 levels of the Corps hierarchy and was, everyone agreed, very solid. On day 3 of the formal proceedings, the lead Velori delegate proposed a framework structure that Consul Diaz received politely, and then set aside in favor of an alternative proposal that, she explained, reflected certain additional contextual information her team had developed during the preparatory period. The alternative proposal named 3 specific logistics transactions by their GCA archive references. The Velori delegation asked for a recess. The recess lasted 6 hours. The second session began with the compact's lead delegate indicating, with the careful phrasing of someone who has realized their audience knows more than expected, that there were certain aspects of the existing arrangement that the compact would be willing to revisit. The negotiation that resulted took 4 weeks rather than the expected 11 days. It produced a binding framework. The outer arc extraction rights were formalized. The transit lanes were reclassified under GCA protected status. The informal tariff structure was dismantled by reference to specific archive transactions that the compact's leadership had not realized anyone could cite. 17 stations in the outer arc had a good year, then another. Marcus Webb's notes from the preparatory period were not included in the Corps report. His note-taking during the formal proceedings was cited by Consul Diaz in her assessment as diligent and reliable. He was promoted 18 months later to junior negotiator. He packed for his second posting outside Saul with a new pamphlet, Cultural Sensitivity in Multi-Species Environments, updated edition, 12 pages, and read it 3 times on the transport, making notes in the margins about which sections were accurate, approximately correct, and wrong about which system. On Helix Station, there was a table in the mess hall that still had a 3-meter clearance around it on busy rotations. He didn't sit at it again. Not because he was afraid of it. Because he'd learned, eventually, to read the room. Though he still, sometimes, found himself back on page 3,